Every day, the orphan boy shared his only food with a homeless man. When the man revealed who he really was at the adoption hearing, everyone in the courtroom burst into tears. Early in the morning, Emil woke up in the orphanage where he lived with 3 other children in a small room with plain wooden beds. He was 10 years old, thin, and he had large, curious eyes. He rose quietly from his bed and made sure not to wake the others. The room felt cold and the blankets were thin, but this was what he was used to. He reached for his old backpack and checked that his few belongings were still there. He always did this, even though nobody had ever taken anything from him. He dressed in the simple clothes given to him by the orphanage's small charity bazaar. He wore a pair of used jeans, a faded blue shirt, and sneakers that were a bit too large. His hair was trimmed short, and he tried to keep himself as neat as possible. He had a routine here. He listened to the staff's instructions and never complained. He knew that complaining did not make things easier. He also knew that at some point soon, there would be a re-evaluation of the orphanage's budget, and he might have to move to another place. He did not like to think about that possibility. He went down the hallway to the dining area. Breakfast was simple, cereal with milk, and a slice of bread. The staff was always busy, and there was not much conversation. Emil ate quietly and made sure to save a small part of his bread to add to the lunch he would carry to school. Sometimes he would have a sandwich or a small piece of fruit for lunch. Today he packed a plain cheese sandwich in his backpack. He did not have much, but he was used to that. After breakfast, Emil walked outside. The orphanage was located in a busy area of Warsaw. He left early enough so that he would not be late for school. The streets were crowded with people in suits, workers carrying boxes, and vendors setting up their stands. Car horns and footsteps mixed together, and everyone seemed to be rushing. Emil walked slowly, holding his backpack straps firmly. On the corner of a busy street, he noticed an old man sitting on the sidewalk. The man had a long white beard and wore several layers of torn clothing. He held out a cup, hoping people would drop some change. Emil saw that most people ignored the old man. Some even stepped around him without a second glance. Emil did not have any money. He rarely did. But he had a small lunch that he planned to eat later. He paused and looked at the man. The man looked back, but said nothing. Emil felt uncomfortable standing there, but something inside him told him that this was not right. He thought about all the times he felt invisible in the orphanage, and decided he did not want to make someone else feel that way. He reached into his backpack and pulled out half of his sandwich. He offered it to the man. The old man took the half sandwich and thanked Emil quietly. Emil nodded and continued on his way to school. He felt uncertain. He would have less to eat at lunchtime, but he felt that giving food to the man was the right thing to do. He thought about how others ignored the old man. Emil understood what it was like to feel unwanted or unseen. Though the orphanage staff took care of him and the other children were not cruel, still, he knew he was different from kids who had families. At school, Emil was a good student. He tried his best to pay attention in class and do well on tests. He wanted to show that he was capable, hoping that one day a family might choose him. The teachers noticed that he was quiet and that he often looked sad when other children talked about their parents. Sometimes, when the teacher asked the class to write about their families, Emil would feel a lump in his throat. He would write about the orphanage staff or just keep it brief, never showing how much it hurt. That day in class, Emil did well in reading and math. He listened to the teacher's instructions and completed his assignments on time. During recess, he sat alone on a bench. Other children played tag or traded stories about their parents. Emil tried to focus on something else. He thought about the old man on the sidewalk. He wondered why the man had no home and why nobody seemed to care. Emil thought about what life would be like if he could have a family. He imagined a stable home, someone to take care of him, and never having to worry about being alone. When the school day ended, Emil walked back toward the orphanage. He passed the corner where he had seen the old man that morning. Now, the man was gone. Emil wondered where he slept at night, and if anyone had helped him. He felt a strange connection to this person he barely knew. Both of them lived in situations that were unstable, and neither had the comfort of a family waiting at home. Back at the orphanage, Emil entered the building and climbed the stairs to his shared room. He placed his backpack beside his bed and sat down, thinking about what had happened that day. He knew the orphanage was not his forever home, but he still felt worried about what would happen if he had to move. As he got ready for bed, he wondered why no family had ever chosen him. He was quiet, polite, and tried to do well in school. Perhaps people wanted younger children, or they wanted someone who looked different. He had no answer, so he pushed these thoughts away. That night in his bed, Emil stared at the ceiling for a while before sleeping. He hoped that one day someone would see him the way he was, a child who needed a family. He also hoped that someone would help the old man. Emil closed his eyes and tried to believe that things could change. He had very little, but he knew that he would keep being kind. There was nothing else he could do at this moment. The next morning, Emil woke up and followed the same routine. He dressed in his simple clothes and checked his backpack again. He went to the dining area, ate his cereal and bread, and saved a small piece of bread to add to his lunch for school. The orphanage staff announced that some representatives from social services would visit soon for the re-evaluation of the orphanage's funding. Emil did not know all the details, but he sensed the tension in the air. After breakfast, Emil headed outside. He walked the same route as before, passing the busy streets. He wondered if the old man would be in the same spot. He was not sure if he should share his food again because he already had little for himself, but the thought of ignoring the man felt wrong. When he reached the corner, he saw the man sitting there, holding out his cup. Emil hesitated, only for a second. He opened his backpack and took out a part of his sandwich, then handed it to the man. The old man accepted it and said thank you. Emil noticed something about his eyes, something calm but curious. The man did not say much else. Emil moved on to school without looking back. He felt more confident today. Sharing his food now felt like a small but meaningful gesture. He knew that nobody forced him to do it. He did it because he wanted to help someone who had less than he did. It did not matter if this man never learned his name or never said anything beyond a quiet thanks. At school, Emil's teachers continued to notice that he worked hard and seemed kind, but he rarely played with other children. Most students formed small groups and talked about their families. Emil listened from a distance. Sometimes he smiled if someone said something funny, but he stayed out of their circles. During lunch, he ate what remained of his sandwich. It was smaller now, because he had shared it, but he did not feel regret. He wanted to see the old man again the next day, and perhaps share again. After school, Emil walked back to the orphanage. On his way, he passed the same spot where the old man had been, but now it was empty. He wondered if the man left to find a safer place to sleep, or if he tried to find food elsewhere. Emil returned to the orphanage and headed to his room. He placed his backpack down and glanced at the other children. They were busy with their own things, talking or playing quietly. Emil felt separate from them, not because they were unkind, but because he preferred to keep his worries to himself. Later that afternoon, Emil overheard some staff members talking about the re-evaluation and the possibility of budget cuts. They sounded worried. If the orphanage lost funding, some children might be moved to other institutions. Emil felt anxious. He had been here for a long time, and even though this was not a true home, it was familiar. He did not want to move again. He wondered if anyone was interested in adopting him. Over the years, he had seen other children leave with adoptive families, but nobody had ever chosen him. Before dinner, Emil sat in a small courtyard inside the orphanage's grounds. He looked at the sparse plants and listened to distant traffic sounds. He thought about the old man. He imagined a life in which people would help each other more often. He also wondered why nobody had noticed that he was giving away part of his own lunch. Maybe nobody cared, or maybe everyone was too busy. Emil's mind drifted back to his own situation. He was an orphan, and he sometimes felt invisible. Still, he did not blame the orphanage staff. They had too many children to care for and too few resources. They were not cruel to him. They were just tired and busy. After dinner, which was a simple meal of rice and vegetables, Emil went to his room. He looked at the other children, getting ready for bed. He did not have close friends here, but he was not enemies with anyone either. They knew he kept to himself. Sometimes he felt that they did not understand why he always seemed so quiet. As he settled into bed, he remembered the kind eyes of the old man. He could not understand why someone who looked so kind had to live on the street. Emil promised himself that he would continue to help the man if he could. That night, Emil dreamed of a family. In his dream, there was a warm house, a kitchen with food, and a bedroom that belonged only to him. He saw adults who cared about him, who asked how his day went. In the dream, he smiled freely. He woke up the next morning feeling disappointed that it had only been a dream. Still, he got up and prepared for the day. He reminded himself that at least he could keep doing something kind, like sharing his lunch. It was a small thing, but it was something he could control. As he prepared to leave the orphanage the next day, he carried his backpack with his small lunch. He knew the old man would likely be on that same corner. He did not know the man's name, nor did he know that this man was actually watching him more closely than he realized. Emil only knew that he wanted to do the right thing again. This had become a routine now, and he hoped it would mean something, even if nobody else noticed. That morning, when Emil reached the corner, the old man greeted him with a small smile. It was the first time the man seemed to anticipate his arrival. Emil handed over half of his sandwich without hesitation, and the man thanked him, this time asking softly, "Why do you share your food with me?" Emil shrugged and said, "Because I can. You look like you need it more than me." The old man nodded, his eyes filled with something Emil could not quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. Over the next few days, their exchanges grew less silent. The man told Emil his name was Marek. He spoke in short, quiet sentences, asking Emil about school or commenting on the weather. Emil found it strange but comforting. Marek's presence became a small constant in his otherwise uncertain days. The staff at the orphanage remained preoccupied with the upcoming visit from social services. Emil noticed how tired they looked, their voices hushed with worry. The children, too, seemed more restless. Rumors swirled about who might be moved if funding was cut. Emil tried not to think about it, but the fear lingered. One afternoon, as Emil returned from school, he found Marek standing instead of sitting. The man looked cleaner, his beard trimmed, his layers of clothing less ragged. Emil almost did not recognize him. Marek handed Emil a small folded piece of paper. "You'll need this soon," he said cryptically. Before Emil could ask what it was, Marek turned and disappeared into the crowd. Back at the orphanage, Emil unfolded the paper. It was a note with an address and a name he did not recognize. Confused and a little scared, he hid the note in his backpack. The days passed uneventfully until the morning of the social services visit. The staff prepared meticulously, ensuring everything appeared in order. Emil felt the tension in the air as he went through his morning routine. At breakfast, one of the staff members pulled him aside and told him to be on his best behavior. The visitors might want to speak to some of the children. When the representatives arrived, the orphanage director introduced them to the staff and children. Emil noticed a well-dressed man among them, someone who seemed out of place in the modest surroundings. The man's eyes lingered on Emil briefly before he turned to speak with the director. Emil felt a shiver of recognition but could not place it. Later that day, Emil was called into the director's office. The well-dressed man was there, along with the social workers. They asked Emil about his life at the orphanage, his school, and his dreams for the future. Emil answered honestly but cautiously, unsure of their intentions. Then the man introduced himself as Jakub and revealed that he had been observing Emil for weeks, disguised as Marek. Emil's heart raced as he realized the truth. Jakub explained that he had posed as a homeless man to find someone who showed genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. Emil's simple act of sharing his food had touched him deeply. Jakub was not only a philanthropist, but also someone looking to adopt a child who understood the value of compassion. The social workers confirmed Jakub's story and said he had passed all the necessary checks. Emil's mind swirled with emotions, shock, disbelief, and a glimmer of hope. He barely spoke as the adults discussed the next steps. The director reassured him that no decisions would be made without his consent. That night, Emil lay awake, clutching the note Jakub had given him. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what life could be like beyond the orphanage. In the weeks that followed, Emil and Jakub met several times under the supervision of social workers. Jakub showed Emil pictures of the home he had prepared and talked about the life he wanted to share. Emil remained cautious, but found himself warming to Jakub's sincerity. The other children at the orphanage noticed the attention Emil was receiving and reacted with a mix of envy and curiosity. Emil tried to explain that he had not sought this opportunity, but the tension lingered. Finally, the day of the adoption hearing arrived. Emil sat nervously in the courtroom, surrounded by the director, social workers, and Jakub. When the judge asked Emil to speak, he took a deep breath and recounted how he had met Marek, not knowing he was Jakub. He spoke about how he had shared his food because it felt right, not because he expected anything in return. His voice trembled, but he finished by saying he hoped to find a family where he could belong. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed moved. After a brief deliberation, she approved the adoption, and tears filled Jakub's eyes as he thanked Emil for trusting him. Emil felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he believed that he might have a future filled with love and stability. As Emil left the courtroom, holding Jakub's hand, he glanced back at the orphanage staff and children who had come to support him. He silently promised himself that he would never forget where he came from, or the small act of kindness that had changed his life forever.